10 minutes is all it took between Donald Trump canceling his envoy's flight to Pakistan and Iran transmitting a dramatically improved deal. 10 minutes between the most powerful man on earth publicly walking away and the Islamic Republic blinking first. This single data point reveals more about the true state of this 58-day war than every missile launch combined. Not the ship seizures in Hormuz, not the drone strikes on American destroyers, not the fiery speeches about sovereignty and resistance. The 10-minute paper tells you that Iran's internal situation has crossed a threshold that no public statement can disguise anymore. If you want to understand the real mechanics driving this conflict and what it means for your gas prices and global stability, support this analysis with a like. Share it with everyone who needs the truth behind the headlines, and drop your assessment in the comments. Now, let us get to the facts that every other outlet covering this war is afraid to lay out clearly. What a 10-minute diplomatic turnaround actually means is something every foreign ministry and intelligence service on Earth understands instinctively. It is not routine diplomacy where revised proposals take days of internal review and factional negotiation before transmission. It is a signal of desperation, and desperation is a very specific word that carries a very specific meaning. Desperation is not defeat, because Iran is not surrendering its sovereignty or dismantling its government under American military pressure today. Desperation means Iran's financial emergency, its military damage, and its internal political fracturing have reached a point of crisis. The posture of negotiating from strength, the public declarations about never bowing to American coercion, collapsed in 10 minutes. When Trump physically withdrew from the table, the mask came off, and the operational reality underneath was measured in seconds. Think of this negotiation the way you would understand a brutal labor dispute between a factory owner and a union. The United States controls the factory floor with overwhelming military dominance across the Persian Gulf and verified air superiority. Iran controls the supply chain through its ability to mine the Strait of Hormuz and choke 20% of global energy. Both sides hold cards, but the cards are fundamentally unequal in weight, and in the timeline each side can sustain. America is winning militarily while absorbing domestic political costs that are real and measurable for ordinary American families every day. Iran is losing militarily, but has been winning the narrative war at home by framing every concession as national betrayal. The asymmetry between military leverage and political vulnerability is the engine driving every single round of these talks forward. Here is exactly how Saturday unfolded in a sequence that was anything but impulsive or chaotic on the American side. On Friday the 24th, the White House announced that envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner would fly to Islamabad on Saturday. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi arrived in Islamabad that same Friday and met with Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. He briefed Pakistani officials on Iran's latest proposal, and his spokesperson told Iranian state media something very specific and revealing. Araghchi's team publicly declared that no direct meeting with American officials was planned, despite being in the exact city. He was in Islamabad, where American negotiators were scheduled to arrive, but publicly denied he would sit in the same room. That contradiction, arriving at the negotiating venue while denying you will negotiate, was the specific diplomatic signal Washington read as insufficient movement. The cancellation was not a presidential tantrum triggered by a bad headline or a frustrating morning on the golf course at Mar-a-Lago. It was timed to the precise moment that Pakistani officials confirmed Araghchi had physically departed Islamabad and boarded a plane to Oman. Trump posted on Truth Social with language that every diplomat on earth decoded instantly as a calculated leverage play. Too much time wasted on traveling. Too much work. We will deal by telephone. They can call us anytime they want. Then came the 5 words that carried the full weight of American military and economic dominance behind them clearly. We have all the cards, Trump wrote. And within 10 minutes, the Iranian government proved he was right about that. If Iran's chief negotiator would not stay in the room while expecting American envoys to fly 17 hours for indirect talks, America simply would not make that journey at all. Within those 10 minutes, Iran responded, not literally by telephone, but by transmitting a revised proposal that Trump publicly described as much better. That response time is the admission the Trump administration has been engineering since the ceasefire began on April the 8th. Iran needs a deal, more than it needs to maintain the dignified posture of an equal power negotiating on its own terms. The financial emergency inside Iran, the soldiers and police reportedly not receiving salaries, the fractured political establishment under a new supreme leader, all of it became visible in a 10-minute window. The government that has been launching ballistic missiles at American destroyers and seizing Western ships for 58 days moved its position the instant pressure was applied by walking away. That is not the behavior of a government negotiating from strength, regardless of what its state media broadcasts to domestic audiences. That is the behavior of a government running out of time and resources faster than its adversary. What comes next across these negotiations spans 5 specific issues that form the complete architecture of any possible settlement or resumption of war. Nuclear enrichment, where a 15-year gap separates America's demand for a 20-year moratorium from Iran's counteroffer of 5 years. The physical disposition of approximately 2,000 kilograms of enriched uranium, including 450 kilograms at 60% purity. A $20 billion financial arrangement involving frozen Iranian sovereign assets held in foreign banks under American sanctions pressure since the last decade. The future of Iran's proxy network, including Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias that project Iranian power across the entire region. And sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz itself, the maritime corridor carrying 1/5 of the world's energy supply through waters both sides claim the right to control. Each of those 5 issues carries enough complexity to derail a settlement on its own terms entirely. Together, they form an interlocking puzzle where concession on one issue raises the political cost of concession on every other. Start with enrichment, because enrichment is the foundation on which every other demand either stands or collapses permanently. The technical reality is something most coverage deliberately obscures to avoid explaining the uncomfortable engineering truth underneath the diplomacy. A country that operates centrifuges capable of enriching uranium to 3% for civilian power reactors possesses identical infrastructure to reach 90% weapons-grade material. The difference between a peaceful nuclear program and a weapons program is not technology or equipment, but time and political decision. Think of it as a licensed ammunition factory that agrees to stop producing bullets while keeping every lathe and every blueprint and every pound of brass on the factory floor intact. Iran countered America's proposed 20-year moratorium with 5 years, and that 15-year gap contains the entire strategic calculation of both governments compressed into a single number. Washington needs a timeline long enough to outlast the current Iranian political establishment and allow international verification mechanisms to become institutionally permanent before expiration. Tehran needs a timeline short enough that resuming enrichment remains a credible future option once the military pressure subsides and domestic politics shift. The mediating team assembled from Pakistani diplomats with Egyptian and Turkish analytical input is attempting to bridge that gap through creative sequencing proposals. Yet the deeper problem is that neither side can publicly accept the other's number without triggering a domestic political crisis at home. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization chief has called enrichment a sovereign right that exists beyond the reach of any foreign negotiation whatsoever. America's national security establishment has called anything short of zero enrichment an invitation to the next nuclear crisis within a decade. Now move to the stockpile, because the stockpile is where abstract enrichment policy becomes an operationally immediate threat, measured in weeks, not years. Iran holds approximately 2,000 kilograms of enriched uranium, and roughly 450 kilograms of that sits at 60% purity. Translate breakout capability into language that matters for every person watching this analysis right now on their screen tonight. With existing centrifuges and existing material, Iran could produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a single nuclear device within weeks, if unimpeded. The American demand is total removal from Iranian soil, and Trump claimed Iran agreed to let the United States dig up deeply buried nuclear infrastructure. Russia then offered to take custody of the uranium on Russian territory, proposing storage at its own reprocessing facilities as a compromise. But transferring the most strategically sensitive nuclear material on Earth from one American adversary to another is not non-proliferation, it is relocation. The compromise currently under discussion reveals just how narrow the available diplomatic space has actually become between these two positions. A portion of the highly enriched uranium would be shipped to an unspecified third country whose identity remains one of the most sensitive details in the entire negotiation. A second portion would be downblended inside Iran under International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring to purity levels unusable for weapons production. That arrangement theoretically eliminates immediate breakout capability without forcing Iran to accept the political humiliation of shipping sovereign material to American soil. However, the compromise faces simultaneous attack from two directions that could destroy it before ink ever touches paper on any agreement. American hawks in Congress and the Pentagon argue that any enriched uranium remaining on Iranian territory, regardless of purity level, is unacceptable risk. Iranian hardliners in the Revolutionary Guard and the clerical establishment argue that any uranium leaving Iranian territory is a surrender of national sovereignty. The $20 billion figure anchoring the financial dimension of these talks is the most misunderstood number in the entire negotiation by far. This is not American taxpayer money being handed to the Islamic Republic as a reward for launching missiles at United States Navy destroyers. Iran holds approximately $100 billion in sovereign assets frozen across foreign financial systems under American and international sanctions regimes. Those assets were accumulated from legitimate oil sales and economic activity conducted before the sanctions architecture was imposed over the past decade. The $20 billion represents a partial unfreezing structured with conditions on how released funds can be used by the Iranian government domestically. Connect this directly to the crisis Trump himself described when he told reporters that Iranian soldiers and police are complaining about unpaid salaries. The released funds, whatever the final negotiated figure becomes, are the political oxygen giving Tehran's pragmatist faction enough domestic breathing room to survive making nuclear concessions. The proxy network question is where this negotiation stops being about nuclear physics and financial engineering and becomes about raw existential survival. America demands Iran sever support for Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza and the Houthis in Yemen and Iraqi militias simultaneously. The strategic logic is clear because a nuclear deal that eliminates warheads but preserves the armed network projecting Iranian power solves nothing strategically. But examine Iran's counter logic with equal analytical discipline, because it explains why this issue may prove harder than enrichment itself. The proxy network is Iran's retaliation architecture and its non-nuclear deterrent against the military force that just spent 58 days bombing its territory. Dismantling both the nuclear deterrent and the conventional deterrent simultaneously would leave Iran strategically naked against adversaries who have demonstrated overwhelming willingness to strike. No government in history has voluntarily surrendered every instrument of deterrence it possesses, while the adversary demanding that surrender maintains full-spectrum military dominance. The Strait of Hormuz completes the five-pillar architecture, and here the gap between public demands and private negotiating reality is widest and most exploitable. Iran demands international recognition of sovereignty over the strait, which would place 20% of global energy supply under exclusive Iranian authorization for transit. No American administration can accept that framework, and no Asian economy importing Gulf oil would tolerate its implications for energy security. Yet strip away the sovereignty language, and the underlying interests are surprisingly compatible beneath the rhetorical surface of both positions. Iran needs a guarantee the strait cannot be weaponized against Iranian oil exports during future disputes with Washington or its regional allies. America and its partners need a guarantee of unrestricted commercial navigation, regardless of whatever political crisis erupts between Washington and Tehran next. Russia and China are simultaneously building an alternative verification architecture through their joint IAEA meeting on April 24th that would give Iran international monitoring without American control over the outcome. The fracture inside Iran's political establishment is not the chaotic implosion that American media wants you to imagine tonight. It is a structured competition between two factions with incompatible survival strategies fighting over one supreme leader's ear. Mojtaba Khamenei inherited a war he did not start, a treasury he cannot replenish, and a military absorbing damage daily. The hardliners surrounding the Revolutionary Guard Corps insist that any concession validates the American bombing campaign that destroyed Bandar Abbas. The pragmatists, clustered around President Pezeshkian's civilian government, argue that national survival outweighs revolutionary pride every single time. When Trump walked away on Saturday, the pragmatist argument became impossible to refute inside that room in Tehran. The 10-minute paper was not consensus, but rather the pragmatists physically grabbing the pen before the hardliners could object. Abbas Araghchi is the specific human being carrying the entire weight of that internal war across international borders. He fought Iranian soldiers at 16, earned his doctorate studying crisis diplomacy at Kent, and negotiated the JCPOA for years. Trump's withdrawal from that deal in 2018 was the professional catastrophe that has defined every diplomatic move Araghchi has made since. He returned to Islamabad on Sunday after meeting Oman's Sultan, who has quietly brokered American-Iranian communications for decades. He spent that entire day calling counterparts in Egypt, France, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, simultaneously building redundant channels. The architecture he is constructing is designed to survive exactly the kind of sudden American withdrawal that collapsed Saturday's engagement. Araghchi knows from personal experience that any framework depending on a single channel dies the moment Trump decides to cancel. Trump's declaration that we have all the cards deserves the rigorous operational scrutiny that no mainstream outlet is applying tonight. The American side calculates that its military dominance and economic leverage can sustain current pressure longer than Iran can absorb it. That calculation has real costs hitting American families right now, including gasoline approaching $45 and food prices climbing weekly. Diplomatic isolation from European allies who refuse to join the naval operation is eroding Washington's multilateral credibility across every other theater. But the 10-minute paper validated Trump's bet that Iran's pain threshold sits lower than America's tolerance for economic discomfort today. The critical question Macgregor would identify is whether this leverage has a shelf life that expires before a deal materializes. If Iran's hardliners regain internal dominance and the pragmatist window slams shut, America's cards become irrelevant against an opponent choosing martyrdom. Every concession Iran makes toward American demands costs Tehran exponentially more domestic political capital than the reverse transaction costs Washington. The Islamic Republic's founding mythology is built on resistance to the American-led international order as a sacred obligation. Accepting enrichment limits from the nation that just bombed your ports is not a policy adjustment, but an existential challenge to state identity. The 10-minute paper reveals that financial and military pressure has pushed that challenge from politically unsurvivable to politically survivable, but barely. Compare this to an American president accepting Iranian demands where the domestic cost registers as pragmatic deal-making, not civilizational surrender. This asymmetry means every round of negotiations requires Iran to spend political capital it cannot replenish, while America spends capital it can. The entire negotiation's outcome depends on whether Pezeshkian's pragmatists maintain enough internal support before the hardliners reassert total control. The ceasefire declared April 8th exists on paper, while both sides conduct operations that would constitute acts of war under any definition. Israel has resumed forceful strikes against Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon on direct orders from Netanyahu, testing the boundaries daily. The naval blockade remains fully operational, with mines still sitting in Hormuz shipping lanes, threatening every commercial vessel transiting the strait. 40 international sailors seized from Western ships remain detained in Bandar Abbas, as human leverage Iran has not yet played publicly. 20,000 seafarers from dozens of nations remain trapped in Gulf ports, unable to transit home through mined waters safely. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group maintains its position in the Gulf of Oman, with combat aircraft flying daily patrols overhead. Iran's Zulfikar missiles, the weapons that destroyed 3 American destroyers, sit loaded in their launch tubes, ready for the order. The channels remaining open after Saturday's collapse define the realistic pathway and timeline for whatever comes next in these negotiations. Trump declared phone diplomacy replaces travel diplomacy, while Arachi rebuilds the mediating infrastructure in Islamabad with Pakistani counterparts this week. The Oman back channel, which has quietly facilitated every major American-Iranian diplomatic breakthrough for the past decade, remains fully active. Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia are coordinating as a mediating quartet on diplomatic sidelines to bridge all 5 issues simultaneously. The next 48 hours will reveal whether Iran's improved proposal extends the enrichment moratorium beyond 5 years toward American minimums. Watch for whether a third country destination for the uranium stockpile emerges, because that specific detail unlocks the entire disposition compromise. The financial figures movement toward American conditions on usage restrictions will signal whether the pragmatist faction retained control after Saturday's paper. The 10-minute paper confirms what 58 days of war and thousands of missiles and billions in economic damage have been building toward. The end of this conflict is a negotiating problem now, not a military one. and the terms are being argued, not the outcome. Somewhere between 0 enrichment and 5 years sits a number that both governments can survive domestically without triggering internal collapse. Somewhere between 20 billion and 27 billion sits a financial framework that gives Iran enough oxygen to make concessions. Somewhere between sovereignty over the strait and freedom of navigation through it sits a maritime arrangement both sides can defend. Whether the eventual settlement justifies 58 days of war and every life lost is a question historians will answer later. What is available today is the 10-minute paper, and the 10-minute paper says the gap between these two governments is closing.